Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Retroid Dual Screen Add-on. So this thing is pretty cool. It's an attachment that you will put on the top of your retro handheld to give it a second display. And it has the same 5.5-inch 1080p OLED display found in the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. There are two different add-on options for this handheld. They are both $70. One is just the standard one for Retroid devices. That's what we're looking at here today. So this will fit the Retroid Pocket 5, the Mini, as well as the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. They are also offering what they call an XL version, which doesn't mean a larger screen, just a bigger attachment. That'll be for other handhelds. That one should be coming to me in the next week or two. I'll do a separate video for that. And because there are so many moving parts when it comes to this hardware and the software to get it running, and then also the apps themselves and how they will work with two screens, I don't think it's time to actually do a final review just yet. So I'm going to call this like an impressions or a preliminary review. We're really just going to kind of take a look at the hardware and see what I've figured out over the past few days of testing. And the way I see it, even though it's got some flaws at this price point, it still might be worth your attention. Either way, we got a lot to discuss, so grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, like I mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a work in progress review just because there are some things that are not final in the hardware and we're still waiting on a software update too. The cable that they shipped with this device is different from the one that'll be in retail units. That one's going to be like a really nice thin like ribbon cable. This one instead is just kind of this wonky attachment that they set up for us reviewers. So I'll be getting the retail version of this cable when I get the XL version, which they are shipping out next week. Other than that, in the box we've got a little spec sheet and then the attachment itself. Now this actually comes in three different colors. There's black, transparent white, and then purple. So depending on the color of your device or whatever color combination you want to have set up with your handheld, you've got a few options here. And like I mentioned also, they're going to have two different models. There's the Retroid devices one, or what they're calling the XL version, which is the other devices. The screen is going to be the same size, so even if you see the words XL, it doesn't actually mean it's going to be extra large. Of note, when you buy this screen, they will have an add-on option where you can add the other clip. So for example, if you get the one with the Retroid devices clip, you can buy that other clip for another $15. So if you've got a lot of handhelds lying around, or maybe you expect to expand in the future, that might be a cheaper way to go. So let's take a look at the attachment itself. Now, as far as I know, this is the actual final retail attachment. It's just the cable that is different right now. On the front, we've got the Retroid Pocket logo, and then this is a matte plastic texture that has a little bit of grittiness to it. It looks to be a little bit grittier than the Retroid Pocket 5, but very close, and I actually prefer this grittiness over the original. The overall mechanism itself is very simple. It's literally just a screen and then this clip attachment right here, so you'll put your device inside. Now, this is the one made for Retroid devices, so it only gets about that tall, but that's of course because it's made for the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket Mini. On the right side, we've got a USB-C charging port. So this is going to give you pass-through charging. Since your USB-C port is going to be used to power the screen, this is where you can charge your device at the same time. Now, as far as fast charging is concerned, it actually goes up to 24 watts, which is pretty impressive. That's the same amount of wattage I get when plugging it directly into the Retroid Pocket 5. So I think it's pretty cool that you can have this second screen and still charge it just as quickly. On the left side, we've got these small plus and minus buttons. These are to adjust the brightness of the screen because you can't adjust it within the software itself. And I think it's a pretty clever way of going about it because that means you can use your brightness right here to, adjust this bottom screen. Once you've got that dialed into wherever you would like, then you can use these keys up here at the top to kind of match them, or obviously you can make one brighter than the other. Other than that, we've got our USB-C port right here for video in. And really, this little screen is essentially like one of those external monitors where it just requires a USB-C video input that will also power it, and that's going to make this work. So a lot of those cheaper external monitors you'll find on Amazon for like $100, it's a very similar setup to that. This means that theoretically anything that provides USB-C video out will be able to work on this, including Android devices, your phones, your tablets, even something like the Steam Deck. But bear in mind that compatibility may not be the best. For example, with this Steam Deck, I found that when plugging it in will give you a video output, but it makes a buzzing sound in this screen, which is really weird because this doesn't have any speakers or anything, so that's a little bit odd. So your mileage is going to vary depending on what device will work on this screen outside of the Retroid ecosystem. I'm going to save that for a different video. Once I've got like that other attachment and I can try out a bunch of different handhelds, then I'll just make like a big compatibility chart, at least as of right now. Either way, that's about it on the screen side, so let's talk about the hinge side. So number one, this little screw right here is what holds this hinge together. So if you want to swap out for a different clip, that's how you do it. It's not going to be a plug and play experience. You will have to bust out a screwdriver to actually make that change. But one thing to think about is that because this is relatively swappable, I'm expecting people in the 3D printing and other communities to actually come up with DIY methods to allow people to use other clips or other kind of connections to this screen. I think that's really cool. It's going to open up a world of possibilities. It kind of feels like a breeding ground for the whole cottage industry. Either way, let's take a look at Retroid's clip right here. So you can see it's got a lot of open spaces for it. Number one, I think that probably helps with ventilation. And then also, it makes it so that you're not going to be pressing down on certain parts of the I/O, like the volume buttons and the power buttons. The top part of the clip has these big rubber pads on it, and it also has these gaps right here in the top, which I think makes it so that you're not going to press those power buttons or anything else like that. On the bottom part, we've also got this little rubber padding, which allows us to keep us from scratching our device. And same thing on the back, we've got these rubber pads here. And so in general, when you put your device in, it's only going to be touching the rubber pads, at least in theory. On the back here, we've got this little divot in the center. This is to allow us to put in that ribbon cable when we get the retail one. And so that's what that's there for, to attach it and make it look nice and clean. The current cable they sent me is all sorts of wonky. It's super thick, and it also has like these 90-degree adapters to it. So this is not going to be the final experience, so we're not going to focus on this one too much. Now this thing obviously has a hinge to it, and it'll open up freely up until about 120 degrees. Then it'll click back to 150, and then again to 180. The hinge itself feels relatively soft when you click it. I think it feels a little bit on the loose side compared to some of their other devices, but I think that's a good thing because that means it's not going to put additional strain on the mechanism here, which often will lead to cracks. And that's something we've seen with the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 over the past month or so, is that some people are getting hairline cracks. Now, who knows whether or not the longevity of this hinge is going to be better or worse than the Flip 2, but that's just one of those things you have to kind of take a gamble with when it comes to a hinge. The clip is held in place by these springs, which are pretty darn tough, so it is going to hold your device pretty tightly. Now, to install, all you really do is just kind of put your device in. I usually start at the bottom, and then you just kind of wrap it up top. From there, you want to line up the bottom so the USB port will go directly in the center so that the cable will just go right here. On the top, you can see that it does cover up the I/O. The volume buttons are actually inaccessible. The power button is here and you can click on it and no issues there. But yeah, I cannot adjust the volume once I have the clip on. And Retroid is working on a software update that will allow you to basically swipe down from the bottom and adjust your volume right here up top as well. It's not here just yet. They have to push it in an OTA update, which should be out in the next week or so. For now, I've just been going into the Android settings and adjusting my volume right here. So it's not impossible, but kind of a pain in the butt to have to go into the settings to adjust the volume. So hopefully that'll be fixed very soon. Now, once you have the attachment on here, then it's just a matter of just closing it up. And it does fit pretty darn well with the Retroid Pocket 5. You can see here it's not bumping against like the analog sticks or anything else. My only major concern is that right here is the stress point. So when you close this down, it's touching this hard plastic and it's going right onto the screen. And there's no lip or anything right here. It's just kind of glass and then a very small plastic bezel. And so when I push it down like that, it feels like it's hitting the glass as well as the plastic at the same time. So I've been very gentle about closing this up. There are no like rubber bumpers on anything to make this just a little bit softer. I'm a little bit worried that someone might close this really hard and crack their screen, but only time will tell. Now, Retroid sells their own TPU grip, and I really like it. I actually use it a lot when playing twin stick games on the Retroid Pocket 5, and this will work with this attachment. It is the same sort of attachment process in putting it on, but I will say that you will have to spend a little bit of time making sure that it's kind of flush along here. So what I usually have to do is once I get it in, there's sometimes a little gap up here, and so I have to readjust this and kind of push it back a little bit so that everything is nice and in place. The top side of this TPU grip is a little bit loose, so you really have to make sure that it's properly placed so that you're not pushing down on any of the buttons, and it also feels really well situated. And I will say that this setup right here feels the most balanced to me because I've got this extra grip right here. And so even though it is a bit top heavy, all that weight is actually coming down and going into this bottom part, which again has that nice comfortable grip. So it feels very balanced to hold it like this. And in terms of weight of this whole setup, it is 481 grams. grams. If we remove the grip and just have the Retroid Pocket 5 in the attachment, it's 407 grams. And the attachment on its own without the cable attached is 134 grams. So in general, yes, it is going to add weight to something like the Retroid Pocket Mini, but I still think that it's relatively lightweight considering the fact that this is an entire 5.5-inch screen. Speaking of which, this is what it looks like with the Retroid Pocket Mini. It's actually a pretty darn good fit. It does cover up more of the power button, so it's really hard to get in there. But otherwise, yeah, I think it actually fits really well. I like the fact that it's almost the same width as the device itself, and so it feels really impressive just to have two screens on such a compact form factor. When using the Retroid Pocket Mini like this, it definitely feels a lot more top heavy up here, and so this one does feel a little bit less balanced than the Retroid Pocket 5. But I also think that closing it up, this one is a little bit better of a fit than the Retroid Pocket 5 just because it covers everything all the way up into the analog sticks. And yeah, this one just feels a bit more comfortable. I also like this setup more than the Retroid Pocket 5 because this hard plastic doesn't make contact with the screen when you close it. Instead, it stops at the analog sticks. And so I think that's just a softer way of actually closing things down. You might get a little bit of imprint of the analog sticks on the screen over time, but I think it's well worth it just to keep it a little bit safer. And so overall, even though it does add, like 150-ish grams of bulk to it, I still think it is pretty compact and small. And I kind of like this whole clamshell setup here with the Retroid Pocket Mini in particular, in that it covers everything up and protects it. So I feel like I'm comfortable just chucking this in a bag on its own. It also fits on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but one thing to keep in mind is that this USB-C port is not centered, but you kind of have to center it on the clip because you're going to have the cable right here, which means that this is going to be off-centered when you're actually using it. You can see here that it's to the left, and so that might bother you over time. It's also worth noting that in this period of testing, I was not able to get the Retroid Pocket 4 to actually work. It would plug in and it would actually connect to it, but it would actually turn off both screens instead of showing both. And when you pull it off, it will say display port disconnected. So something's happening, but it's not showing up on the screen. The weird thing is, if I go into settings, then handheld settings, which is where I can adjust, whether or not I can see both outputs and everything else, it actually just crashes my settings menu when I try to open it up. And so I have not been able to actually get this working on the Retroid Pocket 4. And I did check, I am running the latest version of the operating system, so I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I was not able to properly test the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, other than the fact that I can confirm that yes, it will fit. And like I mentioned, I will do a full suite of testing on a bunch of other devices later, but a couple quick previews are the fact that I was able to get it working with the Odin 2 Mini, but because of the position of the clips, it actually presses down on the volume the entire time, and so this can be pretty disruptive. I was also able to test it with the iNeo Pocket Ace. I'm working on a review for this one. And yes, it does cover up some of the I/O, but it doesn't actually press on any of the buttons. So this is going to be a pretty good fit. The Anbernic RG477M just barely fits inside, but it has the same issue as the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, where the USB-C port is off-center. In addition, it doesn't actually give any video output when you are plugging it in. So this one is fitting, but it's not actually producing any video up top just yet. But I know that Anbernic is working on something on their own operating system to support things like external screens. I think they're coming out with their own. So I think it's really just a matter of time. So now let's talk about what it's like to actually use this thing. So you're going to plug in your cable both here at the top as well as on the bottom. And then once that's all connected, you should be good to go. You'll get an indication here that says display port connected. And then after that, it will also say something about the Retroid Pocket touchscreen connected. And from there, by default, it's just going to duplicate your display. So you can just kind of go back and forth like this. And this top is also a touchscreen, so you can do the same thing here. So this means that you can slide down from the top, either from the bottom or from the top screen. It's all going to be up to you. Now the displays on these are exactly the same. So 1080p, 5.5 inches OLED. And we've got a really high range of brightness options. So you can see here that I'm running at about maybe 35-40% here on the bottom screen. And this is at the lowest setting right here up top. So it gets very dark, but it also gets very, very bright. If I hold onto this brightness button, you can see just how bright it gets here at 100%. It just kind of washes everything out. So yes, these are excellent displays, all things considered. So in terms of brightness and saturation, as well as overall contrast ratio, it looks to be identical between the two for me. So yes, I love the fact that I'm basically getting double of the Retroid Pocket 5 screen, which is one of my favorite in this size. Now by default, it's just going to duplicate your screen. So when you open up an app, it's going to show on both, but Retroid has a new software update. They sent me an early preview of it that'll allow for multitasking. The way this works is that you just press and hold on any of the apps, and there's an option here that says Screen Launch. You click on that, and it says you can open it up globally, internally, or externally. So if I leave it at global, that means it's just going to open it up on both screens. If I do internal screens, it means it's only going to open up on this bottom one, and then obviously external means only up top. So let's set this one to external screen. So now what happens if I open up this app, you can see that it only shows up top. So this is how you multitask. You can have your game running up front, and then you can add anything else down below. So you can go into Chrome, open up an FAQ page, or maybe, watch a YouTube video while you're playing. And so you've got a lot of options here, and you obviously can do that vice versa. So the way this works, if I've got two apps going at once, I've got Horizon Chase and then YouTube watching some tropical fish, whichever one is in focus is the one that the controls are going to work for. So right now, I've got the YouTube channel on focus, which means that the controls are not going to work with Horizon Chase. But when I click on Horizon Chase, that means that now I can control the game. And so you kind of have to swap between the two. And the way this works with RetroArch is actually really handy because anytime that the game is out of focus, it's going to pause. So for example, here I've got F-Zero running, and then I've also got the FAQ page up for this game. You can imagine, this can work with any game, but say I need to scroll on this. As I'm scrolling, it pauses the emulation. And so you can kind of follow through an FAQ or a walkthrough and then just kind of resume and go back into your game. So I really like this kind of two-screen setup when it comes to multitasking. Now the Retroid Pocket Mini is a little bit different. When you actually plug this in, what it's going to do is duplicate your screen, but it's going to duplicate it in the same aspect ratio as your screen is set to. So right now it's 31 by 27, which means we'll get an additional 31 by 27 image right here. Now for this device, we've got a couple different options. We can go into the settings options here, go down into the handheld settings. Under Connect TV, there's an option right here to set the video output method. And so you can force it to be 4:3, which is going to make both of these two screens 4:3. This one's going to be larger than the other. Or we can also change it to 16:9, which is going to make this one go into full screen, but it's going to force 16:9 on this bottom screen too. And so this is kind of a bit of a trade-off. So the workaround that I've been using for this is that when opening up an app, say for example Emulation Station, I can go into the screen launch and then set it to external screen. What this means is when I open it up, it's going to only show on this screen, and by default it's going to resize it to 16:9, which means that I have a full screen option right here, and then I have my full screen option down here, even though they are two different aspect ratios. The cool thing about this is that when you launch a game in Emulation Station like this, it's going to force it to go up top, and so it's going to force it to use this 16:9 aspect ratio again. So for example, here's Game Boy Advance running at a 3:2 aspect ratio up top, and then I can still multitask down here. Now I think a major concern for a lot of people is how are they going to play two-screen games on this device? Because most apps are not created in Android to have a two-screen experience. But thankfully, there have been new forks of a lot of our favorite emulator apps that do account for a dual-screen setup. The four apps I want to talk about are Azahar for Nintendo 3DS, Melon DS, Cemu, as well as PSP of all things. Now Azahar has native two-screen support built into their app, but as of making this video, it's in an early beta. I'll leave a link to all this stuff down below. For the other three, these are all forks of the official apps that have been created by a user who's really focusing on getting a dual-screen setup available for everyone. The hope is that all of these additions they've been doing on their GitHub page will be implemented in the mainline releases, so at some point you can just download all the official apps and this will work out of the box. As it stands, I'll leave a link to all four of the apps that I'm using here, including the beta of Azahar and then the forks of these other three. So let's walk through the setup for each of these. We'll start with Azahar. Now the initial setup will be the same, so you have to add your games, configure your settings, put in your inputs, all the stuff I show in my Android starter guide, that's all going to apply here. The big difference is in the settings menu, and this one in particular, you can go into layout, and down here there's going to be a secondary display screen layout, and you can choose right here what you want your second screen to be, and I'm going to make that my top screen. The only other thing I would recommend doing is in your gamepad settings, under the hotkeys section, make your swap screens and your cycle screens your L3 and R3 buttons. This will allow you to basically toggle through as needed when you start up a game. And really, that's about all you should have to do. When you start up a game, the top screen will show up top, the bottom screen down below. It's going to scale correctly and everything. From there, if you want, you can cycle your layouts and change out, which one's going to be in the top and which one's in the bottom. So you can change all that stuff using these hotkeys in case it's not perfectly aligned. But once you have it set up, that's it. This is probably one of the easiest setups when it comes to dual screen gameplay. It's a lot easier than trying to get it on Windows, which is kind of surprising. Of note, the Snapdragon 865 in the Retroid Pocket 5 is powerful enough, as far as I can tell, to play these games at a 4x native resolution. So this is a 4x upscale. The resolution is 1600 by 960. And so as far as a 3DS setup goes, this has actually been a really excellent experience. It's cool to have two OLED displays on the Retroid Pocket 5 in particular, and the fact that, we have that larger widescreen up top, and then down below we still get a pretty large image, even though it is not quite as wide. So in almost every sense of the word, I feel like this is an upgrade over the original Nintendo 3DS, which is not something I usually say when it comes to 3DS emulation. It's an excellent combination of those OLED displays and the fact that we can play this at a 4x resolution upscale, and we've got those nice solid controls of the Retroid Pocket 5. And admittedly, I'm one of those people who've been pretty pessimistic about 3DS emulation, and I usually say that it's just better on the original console. And I think that visually and in terms of controls, this is probably an upgrade over the original 3DS. There are some other aspects that we need to talk about later when we get into the input latency testing, but as it stands right now, I think this looks awesome. It also looks very good on the Retroid Pocket Mini, where it actually scales it correctly up top, even if you have it set to 31 by 27 for both screens. So this has been an ideal solution as well with the RP Mini. It's just kind of crazy. This thing is so small and compact, but look at how beautiful these two screens are together. Now the Melon DS fork also works really well. You'll want to go into these settings here and then go down into the video section, and then you'll have these options here: external screen layout, internal screen layout, and so on. When you get into these, you're going to have the option to create a profile by pressing that plus button. You can see I have one right here named top. So if I go into this one and I hit edit, this will show you what I have set up, where I basically just made the screen as big as possible while keeping the true aspect ratio. And so that's already set up now with my external screen to be top, and then you have to make sure that your external display screen is set to custom layout. You've got to do the same thing for the internal screen layout. So with this, I just created one that says my layout. I think that was the default, but if you edit it, you can see that yes, I just made it one single screen, which means that I will have my bottom screen right here, my top screen up there. And so those are the settings that you want. You want custom layout for your external display screen, and then you want to create profiles that are going to be single screens for external up top, and then down below your internal one. I've also set this to a 4x resolution, so everything's going to look nice and crisp. And this is the reason why I'm using Melon DS over something like Drastic. Drastic will cap out at a 2x resolution upscale. So this is probably the best way that you can play DS right now on Android. And so much like my experience with 3DS emulation, this feels like one of the best ways to experience Nintendo DS as well. We've got dual OLED displays, and they line up perfectly, which allows you to play certain games like, Bust a Move DS, where it's a vertical game where you can actually feel that verticality, which I think is pretty awesome. It also allows you to use a true two-screen setup for games like Chrono Trigger, which a lot of people think this is the definitive version of that game because it has like additional cutscenes and the ability to use touchscreen controls if you want them. However, we also still need to talk about input latency, which is a factor when it comes to this screen. I have a whole chapter for it here in a minute, but I wanted to go over the setup that I have for these particular systems first. So long story short, I still think this is one of the best looking experiences when it comes to playing 3DS and Nintendo DS. The ability to use an OLED display and upscale it really is something that you have to see to believe. And I love the fact that we are getting all this additional functionality for an additional $70. I feel like it's almost a steal at that point. Okay, so the next app I want to talk about is Cemu. This is going to be for Nintendo Wii U emulation. This is also a very easy setup. When starting up a game, it's just going to duplicate your main screen, but if you go into the side menu, there's an option here that says Show Pad on External Display, so you can set that. And so now you can see this one says, please look at the TV screen, so this one is functioning as your Wii U gamepad, and then this one is your actual television. Now the only shortcoming of this setup is that you cannot have your external display showing down below. All you can do is basically just show it on the external display. There's no way to swap it. So I would love in future iterations of this app the ability to basically choose if it's going to be internal or external, because I think that would make it a lot easier. The other weird thing about this setup is that you cannot use the touchscreen option right here on the screen itself. Instead, you have to touch down here at the bottom to basically match up there. And so it's really kind of awkward. And so as you can imagine, this is just kind of a weird experience where if I wanted to see my gear, I couldn't tap on it here. I'd have to tap on it over on this side. It also doesn't line up perfectly with the top screen, and so often where you think it's going to be is not actually where it is. So it is just a little bit awkward to use. So again, ideally, we would be able to put this screen down at the bottom, and I think that might fix a lot of these issues. To me, it's not that big of a deal because Wii U is a system that didn't have a lot of dual screen mechanics to it anyway, and the Retroid Pocket 5 or the Snapdragon 865 inside of it doesn't really play Wii U all that great anyway. So this is one of those things where it's kind of a nice to have, but not necessarily something that I think is completely essential. And then finally, the last app to talk about is PSP. So we actually have a dual screen option with this one, and it's kind of neat. In the settings, you've got to set it to OpenGL as the backend, and then from there, you've got these external display parameters. So you can go in here and change it, and essentially what you can do is you can play PSP up top, and then you can take a portion of your screen and zoom in with this portion as well. So imagine, for example, you're playing a racing game and you want to be able to see a zoomed in portion of that, either maybe your RPMs or maybe the map. And so instead of having to see it all on the screen, you can just duplicate it down below. And so as you can imagine, there's probably a lot of different things you could do with certain PSP games if you wanted to have this set up. However, I will say that just getting this set up is kind of a pain in the butt because you can't actually see in real time the changes that you're making. So as soon as you actually start to move it around, it says paused up top, and then you're not able to see any of the changes as you make them. So you kind of have to guess between the different parameters. So for example, with Daxter, I was trying to get it so that I could see the map down below, but messing around with all the different parameters, I couldn't get it to work. So I just kind of gave up. So I think it's one of those things where if you really want to see it and you're willing to put the time in, you can probably get something like a mini map showing down below. But for the most part, it might be just fine to play the PSP on its own. And so my big draw here is not necessarily that you can do dual screen PSP, but that I can play PSP at 5.5 inches at a 16:9 aspect ratio. To me, this is kind of the best of both worlds. It really expands the amount of games I want to play on the Retroid Pocket Mini, as opposed to squishing them down and trying to look at it on this smaller screen. I can just bring the second screen with me when I want to play something wider, like PSP or Wii U or Nintendo Switch. Now, so far we've been talking about all the cool things you can do with this screen, but there is one big flaw that I wanted to talk about. And the fact is that I can see quite a bit of latency with the top screen when plugged into one of my devices. Let's take a game like Horizon Chase as our first example. You might see that the top screen is lagging just a little bit. It's kind of hard to see right now, but let me slow it down to 10% speed. And so what you might see on the bottom now is that everything around the car on the bottom screen is a little bit further ahead than it is up top. Let me pause and zoom so you can get a better idea. So here at the bottom, you can see that the orange car is a little bit closer to the bottom of the screen than it is up top. This indicates to me that it's like a frame or two behind up top than it is on the bottom main screen. Now, this may not be something that you can see in real time, but it is definitely something that you can feel. I mean, I'm personally not very susceptible to input lag, and it's something I noticed on the very first day that I was testing this out. So I thought the easiest way to capture this would be to play a stopwatch app and then look at what the difference in time is between the top and bottom screen. But the interesting thing about these apps is that when running them, the times once I paused the image were actually the same or a little bit faster up top, which was very surprising. And so at first glance, I was like, okay, maybe it's just all in my head and maybe this is not that big of a deal if these stopwatch apps are showing something that looks to be okay. So at that point, I decided to take matters into my own hand and use my 240 frames per second option within my iPhone to capture my actual input delay when pressing on a button. Now, the iPhone is not completely reliable in giving a true 240 frames per second, but it at least gives us enough data to be able to compare it one against the other. So here in RetroArch, I'm playing Super Mario Bros. 2 on the NES, and it's the exact same game and it's duplicating on these screens. At first, I tested the amount of frames from the moment I pressed on the button to the moment that Toad started jumping on the bottom. That took 22 frames, and on a 240 frames per second capture, that means 91.67 milliseconds. To give you an idea of a baseline, about 50 milliseconds is the ideal standard. That's going to be what you would see on a CRT with original hardware for the most part. Now after that, I counted my top screen to see how many frames it took to show the exact same image that we saw down below. And this time around, it took 34 frames or 141.67 milliseconds. So we're seeing a 12 frame difference between these two on a 240 frames per second camera. If we divide that by 3, that's going to give us 60 frames per second, which means that we are going to get 3 frames of input delay on the top compared to the bottom. So long story short, when we are duplicating an image, I am seeing a 3-frame delay up top compared to the bottom when playing 60 frames per second content. Next up, I wanted to test specific emulators and the overall experience for each of them. So let's start with Nintendo DS. I started with original hardware here and I tested this, and this got me 14 frames or 58.33 milliseconds. Again, that's pretty darn good when it comes to input delay. On the bottom left, I'm running Melon DS with just this single screen setup, so no additional screen hooked up, and here I got 30 frames per second delay, so about twice as bad as the original DS, 125 milliseconds of delay. And I'm not surprised by 125 milliseconds of input delay, considering that we are running emulation, which is going to be a bit slower, and then also we are running on an Android-based operating system, which tends to have a larger input delay than something like Linux. And then finally, on the bottom right, I counted it with the dual screen setup here, and I got 42 frames of input delay, so 175 milliseconds. So we're looking at something that's nearly 4 times as slow as original hardware, and so that's what I mean when I say that there's some pretty significant input delay when it comes to playing dual screen content. The unfortunate thing about this too is that most DS games are set up that you will be focusing most of your attention on the top screen, which is the one that's going to have the most input delay. Next, I did the same sort of testing, but with Nintendo 3DS. So on the top right, I've got my new Nintendo 2DS XL. This one also gave me 14 frames of delay, much like my DSi, so 58.3 milliseconds. I think that's still very good. On the bottom left, I'm using Azahar just in a single screen mode here, and I got 35 frames of input delay, or 145 milliseconds. So that's still a lot worse than original hardware just in general. This is one of the many reasons why people prefer to play 3DS and DS games on original hardware. It just feels more natural. Now moving over to a dual screen setup on the bottom right, we got 45 frames of input delay, or 187.5 milliseconds. So again here, we're looking at over 3, nearly 4 times the input delay of original hardware. And so this is why it feels rather sluggish. And it's absolutely something that I felt in my testing. It's a huge disappointment because I would love this setup. I think it looks amazing. We have this really high resolution upscale option, but man, it's really hard to get over the fact that everything feels very sluggish when playing in a dual screen mode. At first I thought maybe it had to do with the wonky cable that they sent over to me for testing. You know, after all, it has that additional adapter to it, so maybe there's something going on there. But unfortunately, I used a really fancy Thunderbolt cable, which is, you know, like one of those that cost like $60 on their own, and I got the same amount of delay here, so 45 frames in a dual screen setup. So it definitely doesn't have to do with the cable, but rather the dual screen setup on its own. So the next step was to try a different monitor. Again, I went back to Retroid's original cable, but then I'm just using one of those cheap portable monitors that allow for a USB-C input. And sure enough, testing it this way, it was a lot faster, 34 frames of input delay. So something is definitely up with the Retroid Pocket screen. If I'm able to plug in just a generic portable monitor and get 34 frames of input delay, but then I get 45 frames of input delay with their setup, then obviously something is going on there. And whether or not this is a big deal to you really comes down to the type of games that you're going to be playing. If you're just going to be playing something that's more turn-based or maybe not so action-oriented, then I think it'll be just fine if you want to play, say, for example, Pokemon or role-playing games. All those will be absolutely fine. But when it comes to things like fighting games or driving games or action platformers, all of these games, I would say, you can definitely feel that input delay. You could also do some other workarounds. For example, you could display the action-oriented stuff down below and then have the other stuff that's secondary up top, so it doesn't really matter if it's delayed. And this is going to feel a little bit better as you're using it, but it also doesn't really stay true to the overall layout and the way these games were designed. And so I feel like this is a bit of a compromise as well, which is unfortunate. Regardless, I don't like the fact that I have to pick and choose how I'm going to play my games based on the input latency of this top screen, which I think is just kind of a setback overall. Okay, now let's talk about battery life and what I saw in my testing. I did a couple different setups here just to give you an idea of how much more battery it's going to take by using this second screen. Let's start with 3DS, so I'm playing it in your typical single screen setup where I have both screens showing at once with Azahar at a 4x resolution upscale. For all these tests, I did them at 50% brightness, 50% volume, and then I just tested them for 1 hour and saw how much battery drain I got over that period. So with this setup, I got 21% battery drop in 1 hour, which means that if we extrapolate that for the rest of the remaining battery life, that means you can expect 4 hours and 46 minutes from 100% to 0. Next, I tested these same parameters, but with the dual screen setup. So again, as a HAR 4X resolution, same game, 50% brightness, 50% volume, and in 1 hour it lost 33% battery life. So instead of getting nearly 5 hours of battery life, we're getting a little bit over 3. So there is definitely a big battery requirement of having 2 of these screens going at once. So this is the type of battery life drain that I would expect with a 2-screen setup. It's not quite twice as bad as with a single screen, but definitely a lot worse. Let's do one more example. This time we're going to do the Retroid Pocket Mini playing PSP at a 4X resolution upscale. This emulator runs really well. It doesn't require much of the CPU, and so we only lost 9% battery life in 1 hour. And if we put that together in a 100% battery environment, that means that, yeah, you should expect over 11 hours of gameplay at a 1080p upscale, which is crazy. The big thing here is that I just wouldn't really want to play PSP on such a small screen. So let's blow it up and put it on a second display instead. This time, because we don't actually need to see that bottom screen, let's just turn it off and see how the battery life is going to be this way. And so here we got an 18% battery drain as opposed to 9%. So it is literally about twice as bad as it was when just showing it on the native display. So instead of getting 11 hours of battery life, we're now getting 5 hours and 33 minutes. So this shows that it does take quite a bit of juice to power that secondary display. So something to bear in mind as well is that battery life is going to be quite a bit worse when using a 2-screen setup, even if you're only going to be showing that one top screen. Okay, so that's all the testing I was able to handle in the first few days with this add-on. So let's wrap things up and talk about my findings so far. Again, this is not a final review, but this is what I like and what I don't like, at least as of right now. We'll start with the things I like, and number one is the fact that I think it's a great screen. Just like I loved it on the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, it's really awesome to have 2 OLED displays on your retro handheld. I also really love this price point. I think that $70 for an add-on attachment like this kind of puts it in an impulse buy territory, and I love the idea of being able to expand the playability of your handheld. It really does open up a lot of options, including dual screen gaming with 3DS and DS, but then also multitask gaming. So I love the fact that this just improves upon your experience even more. I also appreciate that they integrated some operating system functionality into this 2-screen setup. So the fact that we can choose which app will show on which screen when we launch it, I think is a really nice integration. So I appreciate that they did that, and I hope they continue to refine this more. It's also great that we have community members and other emulator developers who have made all of these apps compatible with a 2-screen setup. So now we can seamlessly play things like 3DS and Nintendo DS with just a couple settings tweaks. That's amazing. I also love that there's a ton of DIY potential. You know, this uses a universal USB-C cable, which means that you could potentially use other cables with this screen setup to allow for other devices. I also think the 3D printed community is going to have a great time messing around with all the options that they have here. They can make their own clips and expand its usability even more. However, even though I am very excited about this setup, I think there are some things that need to be improved. And number one is the inherent latency in the screen. When testing emulation platforms, I found an average of about 50 milliseconds of latency between the bottom and the top screen. And bear in mind that is added latency on top of the inherent input delay that's already there from things like emulation and the Android platform itself. It is definitely to the point where I found action-heavy games to be sluggish on that top display, which is a real bummer for me. Also bear in mind that because they designed this to work with a bunch of different handhelds, it doesn't feel seamless with any of them. I also assume that they designed this attachment after they had designed the handheld, so they're kind of working backwards here to try to make everything backwards compatible. And the end product is that it just doesn't feel super seamless with everything. It kind of feels like an accessory that is slapped on. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but if you're looking for a very seamless look and something that just kind of fits naturally, this is not it. I was also expecting this to take more battery life than it would with just a single screen setup, but I was kind of surprised at how much battery it required, upwards of twice as much battery compared to just using a single screen. Now, thankfully, a lot of these Android-based devices have really good battery life, so it's not to the point of being unplayable, but something to bear in mind is that, yes, your battery's going to drain a lot faster. And finally, the thing I kept thinking about with this is that it's a really good first try, but there are going to be better dual screen options out there someday. I think that this dual screen setup is a really good first step in adding this kind of functionality to our Android-based handhelds, and the fact that it does work so well already is a really cool testament to how much people have been working towards a solution like this. There were some times when I was testing this and I thought, this is super neat, but there are definitely some shortcomings to it. You know, that input delay is probably my biggest complaint, but then also it does drain the battery pretty quickly. But I feel like the major nuts and bolts, the fact that we can actually play 3DS and DS games on a dual screen Android-based handheld is a really neat milestone, and we finally have it here. So I would say that over my first few days of testing with this kind of setup, I think that people who are like me, who like tinkering around with this stuff and just kind of messing around with settings and getting things to work more naturally for DS and 3DS, I think you're going to really enjoy it. And I think that $70 on top of the device you already own is really a pretty good price. We've got a 5.5-inch OLED display with a 1080p resolution and touchscreen functionality that works over USB-C. I think overall this attachment is really a pretty good deal. The major thing holding me back is that input delay, because I feel like people who are like me, who want to test around and tinker and stuff, are also the people who don't really tolerate high levels of input delay. And so I feel this being kind of a catch-22, where yes, it is awesome, but no, the gameplay experience is not as great as I would like it to be. So in the end, I think it is an accessory that is easy to recommend based on the price point, but not easy to recommend based on the overall gameplay experience right now. So that's why this is not a final review just yet. I need some more time to test with it, and I also want to try out the other accessories and their original ribbon cable when it comes in. And so yes, I'll do another video on this in the future and see what other things I can get working with it and whether or not the whole situation is going to improve. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. This thing has a lot of promise to it, and I can't wait to hear all the potential use case scenarios that other people come up with as well. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.